Thank you so much, Lisa, for such a lovely introduction. And thank you, Barbara, for inviting me today. I'm so excited to be here. I don't always think about my work as being about learning per se, but I'm hoping that there's a lot of connections that can be drawn with how we think about language and social groups and social interactions, and how that could inform, learning in a variety of contexts. So I'm going to talk today about how linguistic diversity marks social groups and facilitates interpersonal communication. So if you look out in the world, you might notice that there are social groups. It's probably, it's kind of an obvious feature of human societies and human interactions. Groups can be quite arbitrary. So some very classic studies in social psychology will do things like bring an individual into a lab and, have them participate on a task, such as estimating a series of dots, and then say, you're an underestimator. You tend to underestimate the number of dots here. It's actually not true. This is kind of, randomly assigned, whether someone's told that he or she underestimated or overestimated. And then they find that that underestimator subsequently likes other underestimators and wants to give other underestimators more resources. So again, this is completely fabricated and silly, and you can imagine how this might play out when you start to think about real divisions, things that people encounter on there, or real, at least as determined by how people psychologically perceive them, things like gender and race and age that people tend to encounter. There's a number of studies that show that it's really difficult to suppress attention to these categories, even when people are trying not to think about them. So again, kind of a classic illustration would be something like you move into a new apartment building, you're really, frantic and busy and carrying boxes, and you meet your neighbor, and afterwards you have absolutely no idea who this person was. You're embarrassed. You're not going to be able to pick her out at the mailboxes, except for the fact perhaps that you might remember that she's a middle-aged white woman, something like this. Okay. But something that is often lacking in a lot of this research that thinks about how we carve out the social world, how we identify things like in-group and out-group members, is the idea of language. So here is a bit of Old Testament trivia, which goes as follows. The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan, and whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead asked him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he replied no, they said, "All right, say Shibboleth." If he said Sibboleth because he could not pronounce the word correctly, they seized him and killed him at the fords of the Jordan. 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. Okay, so this is a particularly bloody and ancient example, but I think the idea here is clear that when you hear how somebody speaks, it's really hard for them to convey anything but who they are. That how you speak is going to be sort of this signal of who your native group was, and as anybody who's tried to learn a non-native language into adulthood can attest to, and Alyssa can tell us, as we saw, a beautiful graph depicting this, it is quite difficult to learn a non-native language, and in this case, a non-native phonology into adulthood. Okay, so, I think that this is something we see in modern times too. A less bloody example, this is from a 2010 gubernatorial primary.
I'm Tim James. Why do our politicians make us give driver's license exams in 12 languages? This is Alabama. We speak English. If you want to live here, learn it. We're only giving that test in English, if I'm governor.
Okay. He unfortunately did lose his party's primary. So, okay, but you get this idea of how we speak is going to convey something about who we are. And if somebody feels, and you can imagine this might be bigoted, but you can also understand how this might occur, that if people see language as fundamentally marking group identity and you're in a group, then that might be some of the reasons why people might have a sense of nervousness about somebody being in that group who doesn't belong. So this idea that language marks social groups is really not a new idea, and you can look across the social and behavioral sciences and see, research from ethnographers, psycholinguists, anthropologists, sociologists, who say that language divides and marks groups. People evaluate others based on how they sound. There are some really elegant studies beginning in the 1960s by psycholinguists in Montreal where naive participants would evaluate the speech of different people. So for instance, you might listen to somebody who was speaking in English and then listen to somebody who was speaking in French. Now, unbeknownst to participants, this was actually the same bilingual speaker producing both speech samples, and participants would would say things like, oh, that first guy, he just sounded, smarter and nicer and taller than that second one. But again, it was the same person. And so you can see how these stereotypes about groups can be applied to novel individuals based on how they sound. Yet, with a few really lovely exceptions, language as a social category is underrepresented in research by experimental psychologists who seek to understand the origins and development and nature of human social groups. So that's something that I want to talk about today, this idea that beginning early in life, are humans really set up to see language as fundamentally marking social groups? Do we evaluate other people based on how they sound, and what are the consequences of that? So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about three things. So first, I'm going to provide evidence that language really divides the world beginning early in life, that when we hear language, we're not just listening to the content of what somebody is saying, but also the way that somebody speaks is providing a lot of information about who that person is. Whether that's truthful information or not, people are interpreting that information as being there. I'm going to show you that this attention to someone's language or their accent can actually matter more than attention to that person's race. So in that sense, this idea of this kind of really important way that we're going to evaluate people, language can actually rise above other kinds of variables that we hear discussed much more frequently when we're thinking about human social groups. And then I'm going to flip the talk in the third part. So moving from saying, how do children and adults evaluate others based on their linguistic diversity, based on different ways that they speak, how does growing up in an environment where you encounter diverse speakers, how does this impact kids developing communication abilities? With the hypothesis that although children may judge others based on their speech, based on diversity in their speech, being exposed to a diverse group of speakers, a diverse group of languages can actually have positive impacts on kids' ability to communicate even just in one language. Okay, so first, languages divide the social world. Language exposure provides children's first contact to the social world. Children hear things before they see things, in the sense that already a newborn infant, right away, researchers have found that newborn infants prefer the sound of the language. I say their own language. It doesn't have to be that baby's language. What it means is the language that the baby heard during the end stages of pregnancy. And babies can even discriminate between two different languages, provided that they're sufficiently different. So it seems that right away, humans come into the world detecting variance in language and discriminating differences. So when I was a graduate student, I was interested in the question of whether this early preference for hearing native speech would generalize to a preference for people who speak in native ways, right? So is this just an auditory preference for something that's familiar or something that's set up for language learning, or does this generalize to a social preferences for speakers of one language over another? So I'm going to show you some displays that we showed to 10-month-old babies. So you're going to take the perspective of an infant right now, and these are video displays that the babies would see.
Hey baby, how are you today? I'm so glad you came to play with me, since I love telling stories and playing games.
Coucou bébé, regarde-moi. Comment ça va? Je suis trop contente que tu sois venue me voir, comme j'adore raconter des histoires et jouer à des jeux.
Now you're about to see a little magic trick. Okay, so right at the moment at which the frogs are released, two real frogs seem to come up from out of the screen and are placed on the table in front of the babies. So it seems like it's not that difficult to trick a 10-month-old, and they kind of go along with this. And so we just measure babies reaching for one toy over the other. So it's a simple design, but a few things that I'll note for you is that the language is never actually paired on screen with the toys. So the people speak, and then the toys are presented. The toys are also the same, and so there's nothing really inherently more interesting about one toy or the other. And I should also note that this is all counterbalanced, so half the time the English speaker's on the left and half the time the English speaker's on the right. Now we test two groups of babies here. We test a group of babies who are in the US in monolingual English-speaking homes, and we test a group of babies that are in France in monolingual French-speaking homes. So that way across infants, we can see whether, depending on your own language environment, are babies going to selectively interact with and accept a toy from one person over another. So there's a little image of a baby participating in this study, and that's just what we find. So if you see on the left, babies in France tend to reach more for toys offered by the French speaker. Babies in the US tend to reach more for toys offered by the English speaker. Okay, so we've gone on and looked at these early these early preferences for native speakers in a few different ways. We've looked at food choices with slightly older babies. So here now you see somebody who speaks in English and eats a purple sauce, somebody who speaks in French and eats this green fruit sauce. And then babies are given and then they're given a chance to eat both of those foods. So we actually don't see preferences at this first stage. So babies at this age, for anybody who's met a 12-month-old baby, really like to put things in their mouths and really like to eat things. So babies, accept quite gladly food from both a French speaker and an English speaker. But then when they're given this second choice, so they've just had both foods and now they're placed again equidistant from the infant, but far enough that babies have to select one or the other, we find that on this second trial, babies choose the English food for a second time. So it's as if this kind of subtle social or cultural learning could be happening, even at a level that you might not detect as a parent as you watch your kid just, put everything in his or her mouth. But nonetheless, kids might be learning something that I think a more general interpretation of this is that babies are learning the kinds of things that are eaten here by people who are like me in my culture, and that this kind of learning happens very early in life. We can go on to old. This is not something that's limited to infancy. When babies are, sort of in the business of learning their native language or languages. And so we can also look at older children's explicit preferences for people. And so in this case, these are static images paired with voices. You can see the child on the left speaks in English. The child on the right speaks in French. We just ask kids, who would you like more? Who would you want to play with? Unsurprisingly, they pick the faces paired with a native voice. Now, these are children, they're 5 years old. Why wouldn't you pick somebody who speaks your language? You could communicate with that person. But then we just do a more subtle contrast of accent. So now here's somebody speaking in a native American accent of English, and here's somebody speaking in a foreign accent. We verify with a second group of children that they understand this accent. It's not that they're treating it as a foreign language. And yet kids' preferences here based on accent seem to be just as robust as their preferences based on language, that they say they like the native accented speakers more. Okay. So these kinds of judgments are not just limited to friendship. Children also, we look at things like imitation for novel tasks that are nonverbal, and we find that children imitate, say, how someone uses an object. They imitate a demonstration from a native speaker more than from a foreign accented speaker. It's also not limited to monolingual children. So these are kids in this, monolingual American context. We've also looked at children in a really highly linguistically diverse context. So these are kids in South Africa, which is a really linguistically diverse place. And those kids, too, preferred native speakers to foreigners. And so this seems to be something that, appears across different kinds of tasks and across different kinds of populations. I'm just going to show you one more data point on this section from kids in the US that, I think that I've been talking about this native versus foreign distinction, but you can also find a number of different distinctions within a language, within a group of native speakers, even within people living in, one place or one city. So here's an example of the development of accent attitudes in the US. I'm going to show you two different examples. Speech samples. One is recorded from someone in Illinois, one is recorded from someone in Tennessee.
In general, dogs are bigger than cats.
In general, dogs are bigger than cats.
So we ask, everybody always laughs, so self-reflect on that. We ask a group of 5 and 6-year-olds in Illinois and Tennessee, who do you like more? And what you see here is they don't I wouldn't say they care a ton. I'm sorry. This is actually, I'm not showing you liking data. Ignore this graph for a moment. When we ask them who they like more, what you see is that kids in the north show a slight preference for the northern over the southern. Kids in the south are really equal between the two. They're probably exposed to people who speak in both ways, particularly through media exposure too. So here's a question about who's nicer and who's smarter, trying to kind of harness typical stereotypes that adults in the US might say about northern versus southern speakers. And what you see here is that 5 and 6-year-old kids in both places don't seem to have any particular views about who these people are and their intellect or their personality variables. When we ask kids, these are kids in 4th grade in both locations, across both places, they think that the northerners sound smarter and the southerners sound nicer. So what I think is interesting about this is that these kind of attitudes or stereotypes are really being developed in parallel across both places, and interestingly, they seem to reflect both positive and perhaps less positive attributes about one's own group. And I think there's interesting questions here too that could relate to learning and how children's own, language or accent or dialect how that fits into what, is considered to be the standard. Okay. So I've shown you a number of demonstrations about how kids care about other people's language and accent. Something you might be wondering, as we were, was, in a number, and most of these studies that I've showed so far, this was a forced choice design. So kids are given the choice between somebody who speaks in a native voice and somebody who speaks in a less native voice in some way, whether that's a different dialect of from their same country, or somebody who is an L2 learner of their language. And so you might be wondering, well, they prefer this kind of at what cost and how much? Is this something that's really a robust phenomenon that they might use in their daily lives, or is this just something, why not pick the thing that's just a little bit more familiar, that's just a little bit easier to understand, and so forth. So one way that we've started to get at these questions is by comparing children's thinking about accent or language to their thinking about race. So I think race provides a really interesting comparison case for understanding human social groups. It divides many societies, including ours. Infants perceive race really early in life. So infants look longer at familiar race faces. I don't think this necessarily has any major social import at that stage in life. These are 3-month-old infants in this particular study. But babies can at least detect race and seem to, their patterns of visual search and looking at faces reflect that detection. And children show social preferences based on race. So, you use a task similar to what I showed you where kids express social preferences based on race, and you'll find that, by around the age of 4 or 5, kids' explicit judgments will often say, they'll say that they like people who are either of their own race or of a familiar or dominant race in their society. Okay. But when I show them that toy-giving task that I showed you, and when I vary race instead of language in terms of what we present to babies seem to select toys equally, that they care a lot more about how somebody speaks than how they look, at least on that early task. We can then go on and look at older kids too. So now these are going to be white monolingual kids in the US who are participating in this task. And what they see here is somebody who is of the child's own race and speaks in a foreign accent versus somebody who's of a different race and speaks in a native accent. So we're really pitting accent against race to see what matters more to kids. When we look at either variable in isolation, so here's preferences based just on accent or preferences based just on race, you see robust attention to both variables, so kids can distinguish these variables in our stimuli set. They seem to be near ceiling at preferring the more familiar in either case. Yet when we pit accent against race, kids prefer the native accented people even if they're of a different race, as opposed to the foreign accented people who share their race. And so in this sense, I think that a lot of research that's found evidence of race-based preferences early in life, that those preferences might not be as robust as they might at first appear on the surface, that I think that children might be making sort of a split-second judgment, but the second that person opens his mouth to give more information about who he is, these race-based preferences can really be eclipsed. Let me show you a second demonstration of this. So this is a task where we asked children to make predictions about growth across the lifespan. So children here are shown an image of a child and then two adults. And the question is, which adult does this child grow up to be? Okay, so I'll give you an example child. So you're going to meet a child and hear what she sounds like, and then you're going to see two adults. And the question is, which adult does the child grow up to be?
Sometimes there is a seesaw at the park.
Sledding is a sport that is played in the snow. Quand il fait froid, on peut faire de la luge.
Okay, so as savvy adults, you may have noticed that neither person was a perfect match. So one adult matched the child's race but not her language, and one matched her language but not her race. Now again, we can present these same stimuli to children manipulating just one variable or the other, and they're at ceiling at picking either the race match or the language match. Okay, so when we pit them against each other, I'm going to show you data first from 9 and 10-year-old white children tested in Chicago who say that they pick the race match. They can say things explicitly like, people tend to kind of look the same. Somebody might speak two languages, or she might move and learn a new language, and so they can really justify their responses. And honestly, sometimes they kind of look at us like it's a weird question that we're asking them, that we don't know the answer to this. But then we tested a group of kindergarten children in Chicago. So these are 5-year-olds. They're predominantly white children in Chicago, and they picked the language match, which we thought was pretty surprising. That they thought that somebody's language is such a stable feature of her identity over time that it might, it would be a constant predictor of her identity, even if that meant undergoing a really dramatic change in physical appearance. So we wondered, now these were kids who were tested, I was at the University of Chicago, and these were kids who were tested in my lab there and at the University Affiliated Lab School, which is really a diverse area of the city. And we wondered, these kids are in a really interesting and probably not representative situation if you think about American children in general, say. So we drove about 4 hours north to a really homogeneous area of Wisconsin where basically everybody spoke English and everybody was white, and we asked a group of kindergarten children there to make the same distinction. And those kids too picked the language match more than the race match. It looks like they're doing so slightly less than the kids in Chicago, but it's not a difference that was statistically reliable. So it seems that these young kids have more of an intuition about language as being something that's really stable and a critical part of somebody's identity over time. So we next wanted to test a group of African American kids living in Chicago. So our idea here was that children from different racial groups in Chicago are going to have really different social experiences. There's evidence that African American parents discuss race much more than do white parents, who often espouse this kind of colorblind ideology about parenting. They also have different experiences in terms of things like the numerical composition of the people that they see. And what we find here is that young African American children look much more like the older white children than the younger white children. And so I think, I can't tell exactly from these data, though I have other reason to think this is the case, that these kids, I think, know something more about race as opposed to necessarily knowing something more about language. My guess is that race for them is a more important variable in somebody's social life, and then they see race as being an important indicator of someone's identity over time. So, what do we make of these data? I think that there's a couple questions that warrant explanation. So one is the difference between the white 5 and 6-year-old, 9 and 10-year-old children, what's happening across development. One possibility, I think, and there's a really nice study that basically asks a question about where children think language comes from. Is language something that's acquired from your environment, or is language something that might be inherited from your parents or even present at birth? And this study by Hirschfeld and Gelman suggests that the latter is true. So what they do here is they tell children stories about a child who is born to one set of parents, say parents who speak English, and then goes to live from birth with a different set of parents, say who speak Portuguese. And the question is, will this child grow up to speak English like his birth parents or Portuguese Portuguese like his adoptive parents. And the answer for these young kids seems to be that they think he'll grow up to speak English like his birth parents. So kind of this idea that language might be inherited or transmitted through some sort of a biological process as opposed to acquired through an individual's environment. Okay, so one possibility is that children might have sort of a different theory about language and how it works and how it's acquired than do adults. Another thing, of course, to think about is the difference between white American and African American 5- and 6-year-old kids, where I think that social context clearly influences the development of social categorization in this sense, that these kids are living in the same neighborhood, attending the same school, and yet they're having presumably really different kinds of social experiences that are impacting how they see social identity over time. Okay. I also think there's really interesting questions about thinking about language into adulthood that, is this naive theory of language is something that's, such a fundamental part of an individual's identity that it could, survive a dramatic change in physical appearance? Is this something that we might have nonetheless into adulthood? And I think there's reasons to think that this still persists, even if we might explicitly say that we know that languages are acquired. I think that people might nonetheless hold some intuitions that are not so different from those of the young kids. Okay, so, and there's some evidence with adults that when they're trying to categorize somebody's ethnicity, they rely more on accent cues and visual cues to ethnicity as well, just like kids. Okay, so why does language matter so much? I could talk about this for a while, but just for a few ideas, language provides humans first contact with the social world, as I mentioned. Language matters a lot for social identity. There are really interesting studies and observations, say, of bilingual people who are going to have, really different social experiences in their two different languages, which are going to depend, of course, based on the amassed experiences that they've had in each language. I also think that accent is an honest signal of Native group membership in the sense, again, that it's so difficult to learn a non-Native language, and some studies of later second language acquisition show that phonological development is often really a lagging indicator of somebody's success in a second language, in the sense that it is very difficult to when you speak to not betray your Native group allegiances or what might be perceived as those allegiances. And then there's some interesting evidence or hypotheses from evolutionary psychologists, again, thinking about why language and why not always race. And the idea here is that humans may not have evolved to care about race per se, that we see race as mattering so much in modern societies. Yet, if you look back, race is a pretty modern phenomenon that prior to the onset of long-distance migration, humans probably didn't encounter people who looked particularly different. So in that sense, if we have something about our human nature, it's probably set up to detect differences in social groups and patterns of cooperation and conflict and in-groups and out-groups and so forth at a more general level. It's probably not set up to detect skin color as being, the one and only depictor of who somebody's group is. But there's some recent studies that are making a case that given how quickly accent and languages can change over temporal and geographic spaces, that for a much longer time in human history, we may have cared about accent and language differences as differentiating human groups. And I don't think you necessarily need the evolutionary component to explain the modern variants. Nonetheless, I think it's interesting to think about. And I also think it's an interesting thing to think about in a society that often feels so obsessed with race distinctions and race as marking so many features of interpersonal interactions that I think that doesn't have to be the case. That's not a necessary component of human social relationships. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and briefly talk less about how people perceive differences in language and accent, and again, what the impact might be of being in a social world where a child encounters people who speak in different ways, and how that might impact a child's developing ability for interpersonal communication and interpersonal understanding. Okay, so As we just heard, linguistic diversity is the norm, not the exception. That, we are the weird ones in the U.S. who, or, those of us who are monolingual English speakers, that's really an unusual situation worldwide and throughout human history. And there's some evidence that bilingualism, just being exposed to two different languages and switching between those two languages, may result in other cognitive advantages, such as being able to switch between two non-linguistic tasks. But something that my colleagues and I were really interested in is the question less about these cognitive or executive function advantages of bilingual language exposure, and even less about the linguistic, of course, advantages of being exposed to two languages. But what about the social consequences of, this is less about being bilingual per se and more about being in a bilingual environment, being in a place where different people speak in different languages, where you might learn that different contexts are places where different languages are spoken. How does that impact children's developing interpersonal communication? So in this sense, a child who's exposed to multiple language is going to have social experiences that are really different from those of monolingual children. She's going to think about things like who speaks what to whom, who hangs out with which other people, where do you speak this language and where don't you speak this language, who understands what content, and so forth. So it's a lot of extended practice in taking the perspective of other people. And in that sense, that's just going to be, a number of social experiences that a monolingual child wouldn't have. And so we wanted to ask whether multilingual exposure could facilitate the development of effective perspective taking, which is really important for communication skills. So what we did was we showed children, now these are 4 to 6-year-old children from 3 different groups. They're all in the US. Some are monolingual English speakers. Some are bilingual speakers of English and some other language. And some, and I think most interestingly here, we call exposure speakers. So what these are kids who are monolingual in the sense that they only speak English, but they're exposed to another language in the sense that maybe they have a grandparent who speaks a different language, maybe they have exposure with a child care provider who speaks a different language, and so forth. So their parents say, she really only speaks English, but she's had some regular exposure to another language or languages throughout development. And this is a perspective-taking game where you can see on the left the participant's view. And so the participant can see all of these squares in a grid, all of these objects that you see. She's sitting across from an experimenter who sees that some of the squares from her perspective are occluded. So for instance, if the experimenter says, ooh, can you move I see the small car, can you move that small car for me? The participant sees a small, a medium, and a large car, but has to think, well, if the experimenter only sees my medium and large, and she's calling it small, presumably she means my medium, okay? And so, it's a slight difference, but you can see how a lot of issues of communication are going to require not just hearing the literal content of what someone says, as in small car, but taking into account that the pragmatics around the situation, what that person sees and knows, and so forth, to understand the referent of her intended communication. Okay, so what I'm going to graph now are the percentage of correct target choices. So these are monolingual kids who pick the medium car as opposed to their small. They pick it 50% of the time. Now that looks like they're really a chance, but I don't want to speak too poorly of the monolingual kids because this is a hard task. If you're just listening to the content of the speech, you'd pick the small car. So they're picking medium about 50% of the time. Kids who are bilingual pick the medium car about 80% of the time. And most interestingly, I think kids who are bilingual also pick the medium car 80% of the time. And so it seems that I don't think this is about bilingualism. I think this is about being in an environment where multiple languages are spoken. So quickly, I'm almost out of time. Just a few things. The groups didn't differ on a number of other demographic variables that you might be wondering about. Another account is something like maybe this is about group differences in executive function, the ability to inhibit your own perspective to take someone else's. I'm happy to go into that more detail. But what I find is that this kind of classic executive function boost that's been found in bilingual kids, we do find that the bilinguals are better at a task that measures their executive control, but the exposure kids are not. They look just like the monolinguals in that sense, yet they're nonetheless really good at the social communication task. We started to look at this even younger in life. These are 15 to 16-month-old infants who are not speaking very much at all. Here it's a slightly different paradigm, but you can see she says, ooh, I see my car. Can you hand me my car? The baby sees two cars. And so the question is whether she picks the car that is mutually visible. And here we find that babies who are exposed to another, I mean, it's hard to know because they're not really speaking, but parents of babies whose parents report that they're in a bilingual or an exposure environment, they outperform babies who are in a monolingual environment. Okay. So I am out of time. So I'm just going to very quickly wrap up and say that kids exposed to a multilingual environment spontaneously take into account an interlocutor's intended meaning. I think this could set the stage for communication across the lifespan. Some really important questions, I think, are about how malleable this is, what aspects of the early environment matter, and is this an exposure advantage, or, on the flip side, you could think about this as a monolingual disadvantage, which I think would be an equally fair way to characterize the data. So to conclude, language provides a really important way for dividing and interpreting the social world. It's early emerging, it's robust, it's developmentally continuous. It's also informed by cultural context. And I think that exposure to linguistic diversity may be critical for the development of interpersonal communication. I'm going to skip, I had a couple slides extrapolating beyond my data. I will just say quickly, I don't think your baby is racist. So, I think that there's a lot of hype around findings about early race-based awareness, and I think that sometimes they're not measuring something as profound as they seem that they might be. Yet, I think that there's nonetheless room to really think about accent and language as something that we care a lot about and something that we should think about protecting against discrimination based on language. So thank you very much to my students and my colleagues and the NIH, and thank you all for having me. Okay.
I'm interested in finding out about written language and if these effects have been documented in written language, and particularly from a teaching and learning perspective. I'm thinking about things like peer evaluation, particularly in online classes where people are not interacting face-to-face at all.
I would love to do that study. I have the hypothesis that errors made in written text that imply foreignness, as opposed to errors made in written text that just imply you're, a sloppy native speaker who should have done better, something like that, that foreignness is actually going to be downgraded, even though that's not fair. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really good question. And my intuition is that it's probably a problem in written text as well. Mm-hmm.
Hi, so in line with the idea of accents connoting group membership, is there any evidence that accent acquisition might vary with social or emotional intelligence? So for example, if someone is higher in the autism quotient scale, would it be less likely that they develop a regional accent?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there's a lot of variance in this, in the sense that, I say it's, incredibly difficult to develop this non-native phonology late in life, and then, of course, you meet these people, and you're like, this is incredible. How do you sound like that? You moved here when you were 22, something like this. And so, what other kinds of predictors could form, say, could impact your ability to learn a non-native language? And then also you think about, there's these effects about, I like the idea of you're in an environment, how quickly do you take on the properties of that group? And you could imagine, and there's really interesting studies about these sort of chameleon effects. It doesn't even take moving. It just takes two people talking to each other and they start to sound alike, right? And so you could imagine, and people do tend to do that more for somebody whom they like or, think is in their group or something like this. And so, I think it's a really interesting question that if you're either socially motivated to be a member of this group, or for whatever reason you are more socially competent in some ways, do you take on the accent properties more quickly? I think that's a very reasonable hypothesis.
I have a question. Have you conducted any studies or seen any studies on children who, I guess, start with a different language like Spanish, for example, and then through early intervention like ESOL programs, learn English, and then have discriminatory behavior pick up more easily to distinguish one group with another? And what I mean by that is also like they pick up early on a student who may be similar, a Hispanic student, who has an accent, but they no longer have an accent and they're bilingual.
Yeah.
Are there any studies like that?
Yeah, there's some more psycholinguistic studies about people's ability to discriminate subtle variants in accents, and there's this one study, it's called like Army Brats and something, and it's about kids who move to a lot of different places as children, and then as adults, they do seem to be better at making some subtle distinctions in terms of other people perceiving other people's accents. I've also done some studies in the US of kids who, say in that context you describe, who speak Spanish at home and learn English at school, and other languages too, Korean and French, it's not about Spanish per se, and find that those kids seem to, often they seem to be equally open to saying they like speakers of their home language and their school language, but what they really don't like is English spoken with a non-native accent, even when it's the home accent of their parents. And so in that sense, and I think that there could really be a link between these kinds of social preferences for native and the ways in which children tend to adopt the accent that they hear, the more common accent or the accent of their peers.
Okay, I think we'll move to our next speaker. So thank you.